Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to our Krasno Global event. Our two distinguished guests today are Professor Will Gray from the United States and Dr. Ulrike Franke, who joins us from London. Today, we are talking about Germany's global influence, from trading power to the Ukraine war. Will and Ulrike will help us to assess Germany's current foreign policy dilemmas in the context of the Ukraine war and Germany's global influence in past and present. I'm Klaus Laurus, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at UNC Chapel Hill. Today, I'm joining you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, as I'm currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University. Thank you all for joining us. I see that we again have a large international Zoom audience, which of course is very good, and I'm always very pleased to notice that. Please submit your questions in writing with the help of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our Krasno assistants, Leila and Emma, will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Will Gray and Dr. Ulrike Franke to the Krasno Global Event Series today. Both scholars are experts on Germany's European and global policies during both the Cold War and at present. William Gray is an associate professor at Purdue University, and he specializes in modern Germany, the Cold War, and the history of capitalism. Will received his PhD from Yale University, and among many other publications, he's the author of Germany's Cold War, the global campaign to isolate East Germany. And this book was published with UNC Press in 2003. And Will has just published his new book with Cambridge University Press. It is entitled Trading Power, West Germany's Rise to Global Influence. It is a very good read, and I can highly recommend it to you. Our second distinguished speaker today is Dr. Ulrike Franke. Ulrike is also very well published, and she is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in London. Ulrike Franke leads the European Council's Technology and European Power Initiative. Her areas of expertise are German and European security and defense policies, the future of warfare, and the impact of new technologies, such as drones and artificial intelligence, on geopolitics and warfare. Ulrike also hosts the German language podcast Sicherheitshalber, which deals with German and global security and defense policies and is increasingly popular. Ulrike Franke got her PhD from the University of Oxford in the UK, and she also has a BA and an MA from Sciences Po in Paris and the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Thank you, Will and Ulrike, for joining us today. Regarding our procedure today, I thought it would be a good idea if I first interrogate our speakers a little bit before then opening it up to questions from you, the audience. As noted before, please submit your questions via the chat function on your Zoom screen. And the event today will last approximately 90 minutes. Let me start with Will. Will, you have been studying German domestic and foreign policy for quite a few years now. What do you make of the performance of Chancellor Olaf Scholz? For example, when you compare it to Angela Merkel or other recent German chancellors, how is Olaf Scholz doing?
Hi, Klaus and Ulrike, and welcome to everyone in the audience. It's really delightful to see a large number of attendees. So I have to say I would go further back in history than the recent chancellors. Olaf Scholz, to me, is reminiscent of Ludwig Erhard in the 1960s. By that, I mean, he's really struggling to keep his own party behind him, which is a problem that Ludwig Erhard had in his case with the Christian Democratic Union. And he shows a lot of indecision and procrastination in trying to make hard choices. And that's something which I associate very much with the chancellorship of Ludwig Erhard. So it's quite a contrast to Angela Merkel, who ran a very disciplined chancellor's office. And who was much more successful, I think, in aligning her coalition behind her. That being said, what Scholz is trying to do by running a coalition of three completely different parties is unprecedented. And I think that one has to bear in mind that the higher level of difficulty of what he needs to do. Furthermore, no chancellor since 1945 has faced this kind of military scenario. So, you know, I don't think he's doing a great job. On the other hand, the context is very challenging.
Thanks, Will. That's most interesting. Ulrike, can I ask you the same question? Would you agree with Will that Scholz's performance is not all that convincing, or are you more optimistic about what he is doing?
Yeah, I must admit I'm not very impressed by Olaf Scholz's performance so far. I mean, as Will has alluded to, this is a really difficult situation, both just kind of domestically speaking with the three-party coalition and just lots of challenges also domestically, and then of course internationally it's an unprecedented situation. I mean, compared to Angela Merkel, it seems to me that with regard to his style and his demeanor and his kind of whole approach to politics, he's not that different from Angela Merkel. I mean, in a way, he literally campaigned despite him being, you know, him being from the Social Democrats, Angela Merkel being from the Christian Democrats, so the two big parties, if you like, in the German system, so the two competitors throughout the post-war years, he still ran a campaign that basically said, you know, I am similar in character to Angela Merkel, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think this does show, because he's not flashy, he's not he thinks about things for a long time, he's not fast. I mean, he's kind of anti-Macron, if you like, in European politics. So in terms of style, quite similar to Merkel. However, I kind of feel that internationally he communicates worse than Merkel. I've been really struck, I mean, especially, so I work on security and defense question, and that's mainly what I'm going to refer to this evening. I've been really struck how throughout the war in Ukraine, Germany has actually done largely well. I mean, like, German politics with regard to the war in Ukraine is actually pretty good, I'd say, you know, weapons deliveries and support for Ukraine and bringing Europeans together and all of this. Like I have little to criticize other than the speed of it, which has been too slow at every step of the way, and even more so the communication around it. I mean, somehow this government, and I want to say this chancellor, has managed to communicate Germany's politics so badly that Germany has almost become like that most countries, that the countries see Germany most critically, and which really doesn't seem fair if you look at, you know, the actual things that are being done. So in terms of, yeah, political communication, I give really bad grades. And just a kind of last sentence, I mean, what's interesting to me is like, Angela Merkel, of course, was in power for 16 years, and while I thought that overall she was rather good, she was definitely a chancellor who didn't care a lot about security and particularly defense questions, like defense and military and all of this. This is something Germans don't generally care about a lot anyway, and Merkel was very much in line with this, so she never really talked about the Bundeswehr, never really showed a real interest, and that also reflected on what happened to the Bundeswehr. And Olaf Scholz is interesting because, you know, now of course he has to care. I don't think that he would have, yeah, like he was planning to spend that much time on all things military and defense and the Bundeswehr and spend 100 billion on it and all of this. So he was kind of pushed into it, and that's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing at the moment. So yeah, it's definitely a very, very difficult situation, and therefore very tricky to criticize it. But I think at least on political communication and kind of speed on the kind of politics with a small p internationally or in Europe speaking, I haven't been too happy with him.
Thank you. I'm a little surprised by this criticism of Olaf Scholz and the praise of Angela Merkel. When you remember back, Angela Merkel, she made the country dependent on Russia entirely regarding energy and gas. She continued working on Nord Stream 2 in particular, which now is really the bogey thing which shouldn't have been done. She ran down the Bundeswehr, didn't put any money into security, in German security and defense policies, but you still praise her, while Olaf Scholz really hasn't done that much wrong. He may be low profile, but would the German people really like a Rambo in the chancellery, someone like Gerhard Schröder, who was much more glamorous and outspoken? No,
but I neither praised Angela Merkel nor would I say that. I mean, Olaf Scholz, again, what he did wrong is political communication. Like it's really, and I work a lot on kind of European politics and speak to kind of European context, and I find it really striking how negatively Germany has been seen basically since the beginning of the war, despite everything that this government has done and is doing. So again, that's I would say his fault. I wouldn't praise Merkel. Like that was, as I was saying, like she was equally dismissive of security and not equally, she was dismissive of security and defense question for 16 years. She didn't talk about it. That's what I said. So yeah, and I mean the Nord Stream stuff, if we want to get into this, yeah, I wouldn't at this point. Obviously, she's been criticized a lot for her international politics, but on this point of political communication that I was making, she was better. She, was better in the European realm. I have no idea whether she would have managed the war in Ukraine better, but yeah.
Thanks very much. We will come back to the Ukraine war and probably also to Angela Merkel. But let me turn to Will again. Will, you have just published a new book, Trading Power. Tell us about the essence of the book. Why should we read the book and enjoy the book? Is Germany indeed a mere trading power, or has it developed since the 1950s and 1960s? Tell us all about it.
All right. Well, this is a 2-minute version. It's actually quite sketchy because I thought that for the purposes of today's discussion, it would make more sense to draw general themes rather than, I can assure you with 500 pages and 14 chapters, I can't give you a blow by blow, not within the allotted time. But so the title of the book is actually a bit of a play on words, which we academics, I think, seem to fall into a lot these days. What I'm talking about is a trade-off, really, one kind of power giving way to another. In the 60s and 70s, I argue, West German leaders learned the limits of their military potential. They would not become like Britain and France. They would not have nuclear weapons of their own, nor would they be able to participate in nuclear sharing arrangements. They would have to acknowledge this permanent non-nuclear status by signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Furthermore, the Bundeswehr would not participate in out-of-area missions, including UN peacekeeping missions, because first, West Germany's vulnerability as a divided nation, and secondly, because public opinion was highly averse to it. So all in all, a learning process is happening. German elites in 1962-63 don't imagine that they're going to have to fulfill such a limited role militarily, not non-existent, but certainly not commensurate with what they had imagined German capabilities to be. At the same time, West Germans are learning to make use of their economic leverage. They prioritize the maintenance of macroeconomic stability as the basis of German influence. This is a perspective that's articulated very clearly by Ludwig Erhard in 1965. I would refer potential readers to chapter 4 of the book. The stability of West Germany's economy acted as a magnet, drawing demand, heavy demand from Soviet bloc states. This created destabilization for Czechoslovakia in 1968, but after the Soviets successfully crushed what was going on in the Prague Spring, the Soviets gave a green light for Poland and themselves and the GDR and other borrowers to draw in on the West German economy. West Germans embraced the role of paymaster in various multilateral settings, including the EU, NATO, and the United Nations. And German officials recognized at an early date that this lent weight to German ideas on international economic governance. In other words, you pay in, you get more say. By the mid-1970s, Germany's record-setting export surpluses make them uniquely able to withstand the oil shock. This gives them significant leverage in demanding, for example, austerity measures from European partners like Italy and Britain. Finally, under Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, the apparent success of Germany's economic model translated into the creation of several new institutions, including the European Council and the G7. So these two learning processes, in a sense, unlearning certain military ideas, learning certain economic ideas, were not, I would say, inevitable, right? Each one involved a step. And I lay out on a year-by-year basis, I think, how these learning moments are happening. I don't think that these two processes required one another. Perhaps in other circumstances, Germany would have had more of a military role and more of an economic role. It's also possible that Germans never would have learned to use their economic leverage for creating what political scientist Susan Strange calls structural power as opposed to coercive power. In any event, the net result was that Germany traded models of influence. Now, during the Q&A, I'd be very happy to take more specific questions about the writing and structure of the book. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to extract some general lessons about how Germans do or don't wield influence in international affairs. Some of these I think are pretty well known, but I'll offer a sense of how I see them playing out. First, Germans tend to feel comfortable as part of a large, well-structured grouping. The classic case is, of course, Westbindung, the Western integration created by Konrad Adenauer, with an emphasis on reliability and predictability. Now, the flip side of this is that when the international situation grows more complicated, when there are steps toward some kind of more multilateral system, this creates a lot of unease. So I think I see this already in the chancellorship of Ludwig Erhard. The prospect of détente is very unsettling because Germans have a hard time figuring out how to approach a very hostile Soviet Union. It also plays out in different ways in the great nervousness felt in Bonn because of the tensions between the United States and France in the 1960s. This is a well-known discussion covered well in scholarship by Ron Graneri and Tom Schwartz and others. But for our purposes, what I think is interesting is that Germans don't try to take advantage of the situation, right? I think a lot of alliance theorists or political scientists would probably assume that Germany would ride into this breach and attempt to extract gains for themselves. And the opposite happens. They feel trapped by the disagreements. They much prefer living within a whole camp. Within the time span of my book, another significantly disorienting moment comes in 1973, after the most dynamic phase of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik has come to fruition. The international environment was more fluid. Brezhnev even came for a visit to Bonn, but Brandt's government grew extremely nervous trying to please all the neighbors at the same time. So how does this play out in more recent decades? The Federal Republic has felt comfortable lining up with larger entities like the West when acting against terrorism or forces of chaos. But within Europe itself, the dilemma of expanding NATO and the EU without simultaneously alienating Russia has become just impossible to resolve. So what I'm saying is that these multipolar situations have historically induced a lot of anxiety among German decision makers. There's no effort at Schaukelpolitik, which was practiced actively in the Weimar Republic, this idea of playing sides off of one another. That is far, far from German sentiments. Point two, money. Germany's often used financial contributions to show leadership and help rally its European peers, often on behalf of some project by the US. I think a really significant case of this, particularly in contrast with what happened during the Trump years, came in the Nixon era. Nixon is demanding burden sharing. Bonn is quick to pledge additional spending, and then it itself took upon, and basically it volunteered to help solicit contributions from other NATO members. This actually started to work when they rebranded the whole thing as defense improvement. So it didn't seem like payments to Washington, it seemed like just more internal spending. One sees this again in Bonn's constant readiness to be the largest net payer into the budget of the EEC, to get today the EU. I think it's interesting to look at the contrast with Britain. Within 1 year of joining the EEC, the UK was balking at the massive bills created by the Common Agricultural Program, and it demanded renegotiation. But basically, Britain's response was to try and cut down on their obligations, whereas, as I show in the book, in 1966 already, Bonn's State Secretary Wolf Lahr is putting down on paper, listen, if we're the largest net payer, we are going to be able to shape these institutions. And in a lot of ways, I think this plays out quite well. Bonn helps to pay the costs of European monetary cooperation in the 70s in a different way, by frequently letting its currency rise with respect to its European partners.
Can I just interrupt you? But did that
Sure.
not have something to do with the German guilt because of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and also that the German economy was simply more productive than the British economy? So are there factors at play which the British would have ignored or would have taken into consideration regarding the economy?
I certainly think so. Germans find it hard to say no in the long run, which is a separate point I have on my a little schema for you. And that difficulty in saying no, of course, relates to this desire to distance themselves from the impression of being an uncooperative power. But I also think that there's a certain constructive vision which people in Britain seem to lack in terms of what they might want to achieve. The Germans have more positive goals associated with Europe, whereas I think all along for the UK, joining the EU was often just kind of like fear of missing out, you know, and trying to make sure that the EU does, or EEC and then EU, doesn't become something which works against the UK in some way. So they just never really embraced it as a constructive, positive goal in its own right. Maybe that changed a little bit with the British participation in the development of the common market, the 1992 project, right? When the standardization of the European labor market, that was very much something that Britain helped participate in. Okay, so I do want to say one more thing about checkbook diplomacy, which is that it often served the purpose of avoiding tough decisions. This comes up notoriously in the 60s when Bonn is still not recognizing Israel efficiently. It renews, Chancellor Adenauer does this, but Bonn governments follow through on it afterwards, a program called Operation Business Friend. Essentially, it's easier to pay more money to Israel, to keep paying it, rather than to make a difficult decision about diplomatic relations. I think you could say something similar happened in 1991 when Helmut Kohl's government pays massively into the first Gulf War in order to avoid having to make a military contribution. In any event, what I think is interesting about the Ukraine situation now is that the Scholz government hasn't engaged in the kind of rallying of allies that West Germany often did during the Cold War. And I suppose that's because the unsettling aspects of multipolarity from the point above are weighing more heavily. I'm going to skip through. I have some other sort of general points, but I want to make sure this doesn't go on too long. Saying no was an important source of German influence during the Cold War. Although Bonn seldom said no for long. And in that sense, the German behavior about the tank decisions, the Leopard 2 kind of seems to follow this pattern. But when Bonn first started saying no, people were dazzled, right? In November 1968, the government of Kurt Kiesinger hosts a monetary conference in Bonn, and it faces down the concerted pressure of 9 other finance ministers who were demanding West Germany must revalue the Deutsche Mark. And the Kiesinger government won't do it. That episode is actually the centerpiece of the book in a lot of ways. Chronologically, it's coming in chapter 6, I guess, but it's pretty much the heart of the book, and it was very much the inspiration of the book. I wanted to know and study. I came upon this nearly 20 years ago, and ever since I've been working on a lot of projects. But one of the things I've been trying to understand is basically this kind of power, right? The kind of power where your convictions about how currencies should operate leads you to act in a way that earns a lot of anger from your own allies. Another example where Brandt says no, Willy Brandt, surprisingly, the winter of 1973-74, when the European Commission has really expensive plans for a regional development fund. And Bonn lets the timeline for European integration completely blow up. And, an expert on UK politics would have to kind of follow through on this a little bit more, but it's pretty clear that Ted Heath's government, which was quite wobbly at the time in early 1974, would have been significantly helped by some kind of indication that a big payout was coming, courtesy of the Germans and the European community. And instead, the Germans say, no way, not this time. And so these moments of saying no tend to be shocking people precisely because it doesn't happen that often, but it does indicate how much influence you have. Sometimes the biggest influence you have in international affairs is when you are an obstacle to something. However, that saying no often reflected decision paralysis in Bonn. And I think this was not necessarily a very constructive contribution. Examples in the book include 1969, when currency policy divides the Grand Coalition. One party favors revaluation, the other doesn't. And the paralysis creates economic tensions across the continent of Europe. A different kind of polarization in 1972, when Willy Brandt's chancellorship is nearly ended by a vote in the Bundestag. Had the Christian Democrats under Heiner Barzel prevailed in toppling Brandt, the timetable of détente for all the major powers would surely have been affected. I think we saw similar behavior in the coalition politics that were making it very hard for Scholz to offer any kind of positive indications about the Leopard tanks. So again, I want to leave space for you to ask more questions, Klaus. So maybe I'll just mention one more point I think worthy of note right now. My research suggests to me that Germans have not been very good at bargaining, which creates long-term issues for everyone involved. In the 60s, Erhard's government failed to achieve much value in exchange, at least in the near term, for its agreement to the Common Agricultural Policy, which in a lot of ways became one of the EEC's most wasteful ventures. Later, this I think you may not agree with me on, Klaus, but I argue in the book that Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, especially the Moscow Treaty, was very poorly negotiated. Brandt's envoy, Egon Bahr, was more interested in reaching a quick agreement than in worrying about what was actually in it. As a result, essential West German interests were not secured by the treaty. The result was to inflame the suspicion of Western allies and augment the partisan polarization over Ostpolitik. And finally, this is a smaller example, but I think it's very telling. In 1974, Helmut Schmidt, who himself personally was capable of being quite a hard man, Schmidt tried to play hardball to block the implementation of the Regional Development Fund. And the Chancellor's office goes around asking the Bonn ministries, what can we demand? What possibly unacceptable things can we ask of our European partners? And even the very assignment flabbergasted the officials in question. They're simply not used to being unreasonable. And I think this helps to explain why they aren't especially good at negotiations relative to France, where officials very clearly have no problem insisting upon some very minor point and belaboring it to death in order to achieve their results. For various reasons, and I think this probably goes back to what you raised earlier, Klaus, about a certain amount of guilt. Germans simply don't like being the bad boys at the table. And it does, I think my argument is that this actually isn't in people's interests. If Germans get deals that don't actually correspond fully with German interests, this doesn't tend to be completely tenable or workable in the long run. Okay, I'm going to leave my discussion of the book's contents for there because I think we'd like to have a more open conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. That was the most interesting. Let me ask you more about Ostpolitik. That is Willy Brandt's engagement with the East, including the Soviet Union and the Eastern European Soviet satellite states. Now we question, for example, Angela Merkel's gas policy with Russia. Many people are now also questioning whether Ostpolitik of the Cold War made sense all along because of the recent debacle with trying to engage with Putin and trying to have good relations with Putin. Is that really very unhistorical, or would you say there is something in that Ostpolitik's the engagement with the East was a very dubious policy right from the start and should perhaps not have been done?
Something had to be done, for sure. I think that Barr and Brandt were right to say that the strategy of isolating East Germany was not working any longer, and that something needed to be done to build down the hostility of the Soviet bloc. I think that one of the issues that most struck me in research in the 1960s for this book was that the Soviet Union was constantly making threats and was, throughout the international system, defaming the Bonn Republic. And this was a really difficult situation. So finding some way to build down this enmity, I think, was very important. And, in some ways, what Brandt and Barr wanted to do was simply throw out the old ballast. My argument is that they didn't have a clear idea what they wanted to achieve, except for simply stopping with the old policy. For example, there's a lot of literature suggesting that Bonn was pursuing an economic diplomacy with Ostpolitik, and I actually see very little linkage there. That is, Bonn was, in fact, setting the basis for the kind of gas pipelines that have become so controversial in the present day. These are commercial contracts, and the Bonn government is facilitating these, but it's not trying to tie the content of its Ostpolitik treaties with these economic deals one way or another. I mean, the best I could say is that they're sweeteners. So, I don't think that it's fair to lay upon Brandt and Barr the later dependence which we see. I mean, I completely agree with the critiques of Merkel's government. I think if I sounded overly positive toward her long-running regime, I would say it's simply within what was demanded in her day. She appeared to have a pretty stable system in place with some fairly good moral values when it came to refugees and the environment. But yeah, certainly, any government which reigns for a long time and solves the problems of its time tends to pile on problems of another era, or that will become a problem down the road. So going back to Ostpolitik, I don't think the first step was a mistake. I think it could have been handled more effectively. And one wishes that there had been a more concrete idea about how to achieve some kind of gains for inter-German communication as a result of Ostpolitik. That was supposedly the goal, but the East Germans successfully thwarted that all over and over again in the 1970s and 1980s. So I certainly don't side with those people who say Ostpolitik is responsible for the fall of the wall, right? This interhuman dialogue is what ultimately brought things down. That's a very optimistic. What's that?
But it played a role, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that absent Ostpolitik, it's hard to imagine getting to the point of fall of the wall, but I don't think it was sufficient. And so, I guess I would tend to emphasize the larger geopolitical framework rather than simply looking at the internal success of the Ostpolitik. But, I think that already by the 1980s, one is beginning to see a tendency within many in the SPD to not regard the USSR as an enemy, as a hostile power. And I think that the generation that came forward thinking in those ways, kind of certainly rejecting the Ronald Reagan re-upping of the Cold War in the 1980s, I think those are people who are very easily convinced that deepening our relationship with Russia will produce good results. And clearly that was a step too far.
Thank you. Much of the criticism of Germany today, and also really over the last decade or two, is that the Germans have never really aspired to political leadership on an international basis. So as a geopolitical power rather than a geoeconomic power, Germany hasn't really performed at all and has hidden away, if you like. And but you said that Helmut Schmidt was quite a robust politician, and he was a leader in a very hawkish sense sometimes. So during the Schmidt and Kohl years, why didn't the West Germans become more of a leader, at least within the Western world?
That's a great question. And it's certainly one that I've wondered. I mean, my book is called The Rise of West Germany's Global Influence. People aren't seeing as much of that today. So, clearly there was a fall at some point. I think I didn't want to be too heavy-handed about this in my conclusion. I actually, essentially what I would say is that the learning process of the 1960s and 1970s led to good solutions for the 1970s. Those same solutions were effective enough that they kind of remained more or less the basis of German assumptions for many decades to follow, even after the international environment had completely changed. So I think what we've been getting at, I think, is certain failures of the Merkel government to engage in its own learning process. That is, why is it that they didn't perceive the ramping up of the Russian threat from 2014 onward, right? So I guess, that doesn't answer the question about what happened in between, right? I think I would probably say that Helmut Kohl, by placing his cards so much on the European Union, tended to diminish Germany's vision for what happened outside. I mean, Kohl's government did eventually ramp up its military engagement with the Yugoslav wars in 1995, and then later, of course, more dramatically under Schroeder and Fischer. But I think that's kind of the moment where deferring to Europe becomes more of a German habit. So, Schmidt definitely felt like Germany was one of 7 world powers in the G7. And I think that Kohl was a lot more interested in Germany being one of the 3 or 4 leading European powers. And that probably explains why Germany doesn't give the same sense of being a leader beyond the European continent.
So regional power rather than a world power, and that was and has become ingrained in the German politician psyche, I guess. Let me ask you a final question before I turn to Ulrike. If Olaf Scholz is going to read your book over the weekend, if he finds a few hours time to do so, what would be the lessons he could learn from your book to change his policy or to continue his policy today, to make it better?
I think what I would like him to take away is the idea that fighting for stability is not just something that Germans have to practice internally by fighting inflation, but rather that interventions globally in order to achieve a more stable environment have generally been in Germany's interest in the long run. Pursuing policies that will contribute to global stability are perhaps in a more aggressive way will serve German interests in the long run. Look, I'm a historian. At the end of the day, I can only be so prescriptive. I felt a little more comfortable talking about the Trump administration after it was finished, and then I wrote something about it, right? As a historian, I like to have a closed point. And open-ended scenario like history that's still happening isn't quite my wheelhouse. I think that's where Rika can have more to say for us. But overall, what I would hope is that he would think a little bit about a learning process, right? How can Germans learn to operate in the current environment in a way that advances German interests and the more common interests of whatever Germany considers to be its peer group, the West, Europe, etc.
Thank you, Will. Well, we all want to know about the future, and so we would love to hear what the future will bring, but maybe more about that when we'll talk to Ulrike. Ulrike, you are an expert on Germany's current defense and security policy. And what has really shaken the German political world and perhaps the European and global world is the Zeitenwende, which Olaf Scholz announced only 3 days after Russia's aggression against Ukraine on the 24th of February of last year. The Zeitenwende, is it as important as the media has tried to make us believe? Is it impactful regarding German political life, and will it last, or is it going to peter out? What do you think?
So I think, yes, I think this is as relevant as the media has portrayed it. I mean, I always like to point out that when you read or rewatch Olaf Scholz's Zeitenwende speech, what has become known as the Zeitenwende speech, what's interesting is that although today Zeitenwende has become this kind of shorthand for all kinds of policies that Germany has been pursuing in response to the war in Ukraine, he actually uses the term Zeitenwende, kind of turns of time, to describe what's happening, to describe Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there's a subtle difference here that, one is slightly more passive, as in, this is something that's happening to us, and the other one is more active, as in, and these are the responses we have. So I do warn a little bit to not kind of misunderstand this. But nevertheless, of course, in this Zeitenwende speech, there was a lot in there. So just 3 days after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, he basically announced weapons deliveries to Ukraine, and they have been really substantial ever since. And this is something that, Germans weren't particularly comfortable with initially, and there was this kind of taboo of not delivering weapons into active conflict zones. Now, the rule was always that you can very well do this if this is a war where one side is defending itself against illegal aggression, which this very much is. So this wasn't breaking a rule or anything, but nevertheless, this is quite important. And importantly, for the security and the defense realm, the Zeitenwende also includes the financing or the special fund of 100 billion to be spent on rebuilding the Bundeswehr, so the German armed forces. And that's quite something, right? So 100 billion over 5 years extra. I mean, kind of, in addition to the defense budget that was already agreed on, the willingness or the announcement that Germany would indeed reach the 2% goal, so spending 2% of its GDP on security and defense, which is something it kind of had signed up to 2014 already with other NATO partners, but yeah, it never really reached this, and now the government says it will, and the 100 billion are helping that. There were a lot of other decisions, such as buying F-35 planes in order to keep NATO's nuclear sharing going. There are a lot of things that are really noteworthy, and so this is more than, say, the so-called Munich consensus of 2014. So I don't know whether the listeners here necessarily remember, but in 2014 we had the situation that at the Munich Security Conference 2014, a lot of German high-level politicians kind of stood up and said, Germany is going to take on more responsibility internationally, it's going to change its geopolitical role and all of this. And a lot of people really responded to this and said, okay, great, things are changing. And then Germany didn't really do that much. It didn't really deliver. I mean, a few things happened, but not really. And so there's a certain danger, right, that the Zeitenwende could end up being the same thing. But I don't think that this is happening simply because the Munich consensus was just an announcement, right? It was rhetoric, and it had to be filled later on with actual action, and it wasn't. But the Zeitenwende in and of itself already has a lot of things in it. So the 100 billion I was just mentioning, weapons deliveries, all kinds of things. Let
me challenge you a little bit, if I may. When you look at German gas deliveries from Russia to Germany, they were 55% of all energy deliveries 2 years ago. They have been whittled down to almost zero. So that is, and alternative sources have been found. So that is quite a success. But when you look at the defense industry, the security policy, Germany this year, 2023, only still seems to spend 1.4% rather than 2% of its defense budget on defense issues. And also, we all know the deplorable state of the Bundeswehr, lack of ammunition, lack of tanks which actually work, and machine guns which work, and the barracks seem to, where soldiers have to live, seem to be in a very poor state. So how can that be regarded as a success regarding the Zeitenwende?
It's not a success, and I'm not saying that the Zeitenwende is a success. I'm saying it's a big change. It hasn't materialized as much yet as we wanted to. Some of it can't really be expected to materialize as fast as we would like, because you don't turn around the Bundeswehr within a year. Unfortunately, I mean, you barely turn it around within 5 years. So hopefully this is happening. But mistakes were also made. I mean, one mistake really was that the person in charge at the Ministry of Defense wasn't particularly keen on really getting reforms going. And she was eventually replaced. And by the way, we shouldn't just kind of blame her personally. There's lots of kind of bureaucracy around it, but that was certainly a problem. We still operate very much in peacetime mode, and that's the whole problem with the industry. I mean, it is absolutely baffling that 1 year on, the money of the I'm not sure whether any money of the special fund really has properly been spent. I mean, now we had the announcement of the buying the F-35, for example. So that is money that is going to be spent, whether or not it has changed accounts yet or not. Doesn't really quite matter. But very little of it has been spent yet. I think we very much are still in peacetime mode on this. So this is a problem. And the other problem, and this is also why I'm kind of well, I think we should approach Zeitenwende a little bit carefully. For me, there's a real difference between Zeitenwende seen from the inside and from the outside. And what I mean by this is that a lot of the things within the Zeitenwende and being announced there really are quite substantial and quite important. And sorry, baby coming in. So a lot of the Zeitenwende, the Zeitenwende things are quite substantial, seen from the inside. What I mean by this is that buying F-35s in order to continue NATO nuclear sharing, this is a big deal, especially for this coalition government, right? Because we weren't actually sure whether this coalition government would stay in NATO's nuclear sharing, which would have been a big scandal, but it wasn't entirely clear. Now they decided to do this. Big step seen from inside Germany. From outside Germany, it just means that, well, Germany's continuing NATO nuclear sharing, and NATO countries would tell you, well, that's the least you can do. That's what you sign up to. Like, of course you should be doing that. You're not going to get a tap on the back for that. Just as an example. Similarly, with building up the Bundeswehr, again, lots of money, really important, but it just means that Germany is getting working armed forces. Again, the other partners are going to say, like, yeah, you better have working armed forces. Like this is something that we kind of expect from you. And so this makes this quite difficult, that you have these changes that are important and are relevant, but some of them look much bigger from the inside Germany than from the outside. And this also explains to a certain extent why some people in Berlin really feel like they should be getting more recognition for everything that they're doing in the outside, or in the outside world. They say, thank you. I mean, good for you, but
thank you.
This isn't so big as you pretend.
Very good point. And of course, we also have to consider that the SPD has its Helmut Schmidt hawkish wing, but also its very strong pacifist wing still. It's very surprising that the Green Party has turned out to be quite hawkish in the current war in Ukraine, because the Green also have pacifist roots when you go back to the 1970s and 1980s. How can that be explained, that the Greens are actually more hawkish than the SPD right now?
You know what? I don't think this is the hawkishness is surprising. What's surprising is the relative ease with which the Greens are now approaching military and like weapon systems and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I say this because I remember very well, before the election, I was reading all the campaign programs, the party programs, right, the security and defense bits of it, and the foreign policy bits of it. And it was already quite clear that the Greens were hawkish with regard to authoritarian regimes, most importantly Russia and China. They were actually quite clear on saying, you know, we don't want to work with authoritarian regimes that don't accept human rights and that kind of stuff. So I already found them quite hawkish. What worried me at the time, and I said this at the time, is that it felt to me that they were quite strong in their rhetoric, but when it came to defense and military capabilities, which is kind of one element of geopolitical power that you need in order to kind of talk loudly, they were, you know, more pacifist, as you were alluding to, because they were never really comfortable with military and defense issues. So I was kind of worried that we would get a government that was talking quite loudly and taking on this kind of more more hawkish approach, while not having a military kind of power to base this on. In brackets, not to use it, but military power is one element of geopolitical power. In order to be taken seriously, you need that. And so I think what happened is that their positioning towards towards Russia is actually relatively coherent. But what has impressed and surprised me is how much more comfortable they have become talking about weapon systems and military aid, and the fact that the Bundeswehr actually needs capabilities. And I think this is something that that was quite the learning process. There are elements within the kind of more pacifist wing of the Greens that aren't particularly happy with this, but I think they're more comfortable with this than the SPD is with a more hawkish Russia policy, because within the SPD you still have wings that are quite that kind of want to go back to a time where they could deal with Russia more easily.
Thank you. I mean, since Russia's invasion, I think the sides have become pretty clear, and there are very few people who believe that working with Russia is, is possible under the current circumstances. It's much more complex regarding China. We have an authoritarian regime. We had a huge neglect of human rights in China, but you still want or have to trade and have good economic, also good political relations. So that sets the Scholz government apart from, for example, the United States, and also makes it divided within. When you look at the SPD and Scholz himself, who went to Beijing last November, and Baerbock and the Green Party, who are much more hawkish towards China. So we have a real dilemma. How is that going to play out?
Yeah, we have a real dilemma, and we have a real dilemma within the German government here. We have a real dilemma within Europe, the EU, and European partners, and we have a real dilemma within the transatlantic relationship here, because it is this is difficult, and there are kind of understandable arguments on both sides, if you like. If the sides are, either being much more critical and, if you like, aggressive towards China, and being much more with the US approach of saying, China is the main competitor and we need to, decouple and all of this, and the other side of the people saying, like, this might become a self-fulfilling prophecy on the one hand. If you start not creating a conflict, but if you start kind of fueling a conflict, you're going to get a conflict more quickly, at least. But also, we have interests, and these are economic interests with regard to China, that you just can't discard so easily. And that is true. I mean, so Olaf Scholz, even with regard to Russia, where it was much clearer, I mean, they started a war of aggression in Europe, like, that's pretty bad. It was very clear that Olaf Scholz, especially in the first months of the war, on the energy policy, really was trying to kind of balance German interests and kind of say, like, yes, there's the geopolitical element of it, which would advise us to immediately break links with Russia and to condemn this in the strongest term, and kind of have sanctions on gas and oil, immediately. But there's the economic reality, which is we're really dependent on Russian gas and oil. gas in particularly. And if we shut this down tomorrow, maybe our industry and our economy crumbles. And if that happens, that's really bad for Germany. That's really bad for our geopolitical power in the medium term. And as a chancellor, it is kind of my role to make sure that this doesn't happen. And of course, that that wasn't great, and a lot of especially Eastern Europeans criticized him for that. But I think this is how he understood his role as German chancellor, and I find this somewhat understandable. And we have a similar, although much graver situation with regard to China, because Germany, I mean, the German car manufacturers, I'm not telling you anything people don't know, but they depend highly on the German market, and the German industry and German economy depends highly on German car manufacturers. And so it is very difficult to kind of just say, yes, because of geopolitical reasons and the transatlantic relationship and all of this, we gotta have a stronger position towards China and align more with the United States. So I don't have a good answer to this. I mean, there are China specialists that take stronger positions here, but what I'm just saying is that I find it understandable that the German government, and any German government really, is struggling with this. And that there is a really difficult mix of economic interests, kind of certain ideological ideas, and partnerships that make this really difficult. And Germany is working on the China strategy. I mean, we shouldn't expect too much from a piece of paper. It's not gonna, I can't say that much, but this is definitely something that we're working on. And kind of final sentence, I do believe that the war in Ukraine and how the relationship with Russia has developed has really woken up a lot of people to the problem that Germany faces with regard to China. How it will respond to that, again, really difficult to predict, but we have definitely realized that this is a problem, that you can't just see a kind of big authoritarian power in the world as someone, as an economic partner and not care about the rest. That doesn't work. And so this is the big challenge that's coming for Germany, for Europe, and for the transatlantic relationship.
We thank you very much. And we will also have to see whether the Ukraine war has woken up the German political scene to become more of a geopolitical leader. So far, we don't really see that, but things can develop, of course. Let's turn to our audience. Let's ask some questions from the audience. Leila, would you ask the first question, please?
Yes, of course. Stuart Kaplan wants to know if there's any consensus on who was responsible for the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. And with that, he wants to know if assigning responsibility is important to begin with.
I think we need to give that to Ulrike again.
I have no intelligence information on that. No, I mean, I'm reading the same New York Times reports that everyone else is reading. I've been the Spiegel investigation. So at this point, they seem to have identified kind of individuals and a ship and things like that. But who these people are, or rather with what intentions exactly, and who they're affiliated with, again, I know as much as you all from reading the New York Times. I do believe, sure. I mean, it's important to find out who did it. The question is then, like, what exactly, what impact will this have? I mean, unless there are kind of huge surprises, I don't think it would have the biggest impact on the policy going forward. But I hope that we'll get some more information on that. Although, quite honestly, I kind of doubt it. I think what we got now is maybe as much as we'll end up getting, but I'm not an intelligence specialist, so.
Thanks very much, Ulrike. So the question is, did the Russians do it? Did the Ukrainians do it? Did the Americans do it? But we can rule out probably that the Germans did it themselves. Emma, can we?
As in the state of Germany, probably German nationals, I don't. It doesn't look like it at the moment.
Yeah. Emma, can you please ask the next question?
Of course. So Dave Sidor would like to know, how would Germany respond if China provided lethal weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine?
Okay, that's a question for Will.
Well, I do have a thought on that. I actually think that would really freak out people in Germany. I think that might actually make them more reluctant to support sending further weapons to Ukraine. that's I mean, on one level, that's not maybe a completely rational response, but I think that would be seen as a significant escalation that would worry people immensely.
It
Ulrike.
would worry people immensely. It's an interesting, I didn't quite think in that direction, but yeah, I think, I mean, German support for the weapons deliveries, you kind of wonder how they will develop in the long run. Anyway, and it's true that if kind of China enters this, there may be a certain reticence. There may be a fear that this kind of escalates further. But then also, I mean, it would really, how do I best put this? I don't think this would be a clever policy move for China from a kind of European standpoint. What I mean by that is that if China wants to make sure that Europe isn't kind of turning too negatively towards it, and that it's not aligning too much with the US on the whole kind of decoupling thing, then delivering weapons to the war is a very bad move, because it really puts China in the camp of Russia, which at the moment really isn't seen very positively in Germany. And so I think the so-called peace plan that China put forward, that was a very clever move, because that plays right into the narrative of those who, I mean, want to kind of end the war and also want to see China more positively and all of this. So I think that was really clever, although it really wasn't a peace plan. It just kind of was a list of things the Chinese see and feel. But if China were to deliver, were to support Russia with arms, I think that would tell even more people within Germany that China really isn't a partner, and so they may change their policies accordingly, and that may not necessarily be something that China wants. So tricky.
Yeah, thank you. But the Germans will still need the Chinese export market, and there have been rumors that ammunition from China has actually already found its way to Russia. But we will find out more in the near future, I believe. Leila, can you ask the next question?
Yes, Lucy Zhang would like to know, to what extent do you think the migrant crisis in 2015 hindered Germany to achieve higher economic and political success?
Will.
You know, I do think that it was a challenging moment, and Angela Merkel's decision certainly upended European political affairs in a number of ways. First of all, it was a very unilateral move. Secondly, I think it was unsettling to the UK, and I think it played into the anti-immigrant movement there. I certainly wouldn't blame the Brexit outcome on that particular action. But in terms of how this affected Germany, I think the net effects have been very positive. I think that, for example, you know, unlike the United States, which derives a tremendous amount of strength from migration from all areas of the world, Germany doesn't or hasn't historically had as strong of a population presence of peoples from other cultures. And I mean, aside from the sheer demographic need for able-bodied workers in active demographic age ranges, the significant presence of Syrians and Afghanis and others within German society is certainly going to be a pillar of strength for that country going forward.
Thank you. Ulrike, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so just to say, so economically, I mean, I'm sure there are 1,000 studies on this, but this certainly hasn't hurt Germany economically. I would assume it actually has helped, given, you know, migrant labor and all of this, but I don't know. But it's definitely, you can't definitely say that letting in these refugees has hurt Germany economically speaking. Culturally, I mean, I see what you're saying, Will, but I mean, Germany has been a kind of immigration country for quite a while. I mean, from the Gastarbeiter to more recent immigrants. So I wouldn't, we shouldn't pretend that, you know, this is kind of, you know, the first time that there are lots of immigrants coming to Germany. Just to make this clear, not that that's what you said, but just to make this point. Politically, within Europe, I find this quite difficult, because on the one hand, it's this kind of big political move that it kind of goes both ways, because on the one hand, there are people within Europe that still criticize Merkel for this. It was seen as kind of this unilateral move. There are more right-wing kind of anti-immigration parties throughout Europe that have very much used this event to mobilize their voters. So it has had that impact. On the other hand, it also has had the other impact of kind of reminding people, what Europe stands for and the kind of values Europe is supposed to protect. And so I think it kind of the logic goes both ways, and the verdict is still out. And I'm not sure that the counterfactual of kind of not doing that would have, whether Germany would be in a kind of better position geopolitically speaking, or with regard to its power within, for example, the European Union. So it kind of goes both ways.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Tom Schwartz, I just noticed, and he also was puzzled by you talking a lot about Ludwig Erhard and comparing Scholz with Ludwig Erhard. And Tom is wondering, does that mean that Scholz will also fall from power within a couple of years, as Erhard did, or a little longer than a couple of years, but he was a short-lived chancellor? Is that your prediction, Will?
Well, Scholz is younger, relatively. Erhard was already in his 60s and not in finest form, I think, by the time he was chancellor, and that played a role. But yeah, I honestly...
Scholz is 60 or early 60s.
But you know how it is. People are younger relatively today than at the time. I think that it's going to be very hard for anybody who's heading a coalition of three parties to stay in power for very long. If it lasts the entire electoral cycle, and I'll be impressed.
So you are not impressed by what is going on in the current coalition, the bickering and infighting?
I mean, look, I could easily see a breaking point coming for one of the parties, leading to that party to exit, leading the whole thing to collapse. So yeah, I don't think there's an immediate crisis within the coalition, and I have to say, I mean, Ulrike made some very excellent points about some specific, clear, coherent policies that the Scholz government has made. So it's not as if there are no decisions happening and that nothing's moving forward. But yeah, I just it's not quite the Weimar era where you had four parties in government at one time pulling in all different directions, but the FDP and the Greens are quite different in their economic views. The SPD and Greens right now on their military views, like one could see how it would only take one major decision that has to get made one direction or another to cause one of the parties to leave the coalition being disaffected. So that's why I say I would not hold out a lot of expectation for this coalition lasting. Of course, as a historian, I'm not putting too much stock in my own predictive powers.
I hope Scholz is not listening to us today, otherwise he will be very frightened and so scared about losing power soon. Emma, would you have the next question, please?
Yes, so Ray Falk asks, should Russia's war in Ukraine have been an implication for their presence in Kaliningrad, and how ethnically Russian, in terms of the former satellite Russian state, is that population now?
Right. Who would like to address that question? Ulrike, may I ask you?
No idea. Not my wheelhouse.
Can you help, Will?
I'm sorry. I have to admit, I was typing a response. So can you remind me which question I'm trying to do the typing.
Can you repeat the question, Emma? Yeah.
Yes. So Ray Falk asks, should Russia's war in Ukraine, should it have been an implication for their presence in Kaliningrad? And how ethnically Russian is that population now?
Oh, completely. I mean, there's actually, if you want to know about this, there's a brand new book from Cornell Press. German Blood, Slavic Soil, I believe is the title. But it's a study of how Kaliningrad became Russian after World War II by someone who actually had the nerve to go and do the research on the ground in Kaliningrad, which has got to take a certain amount of guts. It's a pretty wild place. So it is completely Russian now. There's not much left. I imagine you could find some German graveyards if you looked around the further remote reaches of the province. But I don't think the conflict will affect Kaliningrad's status very much.
One should add that the Germans have no ambitions to reintegrate Kaliningrad into Germany at all. Leila, would you ask the next question, please?
Yes, of course. Stuart Kaplan would like to know, is there any support in Germany for the ICC arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin?
Ulrike.
Yeah, I think so. I must admit, I haven't really been following the reactions to this as much in recent days. But as far as I can say, yes. Whether this is going to have a kind of real impact, I mean, it kind of restricts where Putin can travel to, but wasn't coming to the West anytime soon anyway. There are a few other countries in there as well. But yeah.
Will that have consequences for any potential peace negotiations with Putin personally or with Russia in order to settle the war?
I don't know. I would be surprised if that played kind of a bigger role, but I'm not enough an expert on.
And it doesn't make it easier if you have a leader classified as a war criminal, justified or not justified. It's difficult to know. Probably justified as far as I can see. But if that is a war criminal and you're supposed to get round the conference table to find a deal to settle the war, that will not make it easier, I would assume.
But that's not the problem here isn't the ICC decision. That's the war crimes, and they are there, and everyone knew about it and talked about them. So I just don't see, like, obviously you don't negotiate and make peace deals with your friends. You make them with your enemies. And so my hunch is I would assume that this won't have a big impact, but I honestly, I mean, this is where the historian may come in more and more general on kind of peace deals. I mean, I honestly, I don't know.
Do you have any inkling on that, Will?
No, I'm actually trying to answer the question about structural power, which is in our Q&A. Perhaps I should leave the Q&A to the expert.
Absolutely. Don't reply to questions. These are questions meant to be asked. Emma, can you ask the next question, please?
There's a follow-up question from Ray Falk regarding the earlier question. And he asks, his question was regarding Kaliningrad concerns whether Russia should be forced to negotiate their presence there in relation to Ukrainian territory.
Will.
I guess I don't exactly see what the advantage would be of trying to put pressure on Russia about this territory. It is kind of hanging out there on the other side of Lithuania, and I guess maybe it's a future source of trouble for Europe. But I think that the world has lived with other exclaves, and they don't necessarily need to be destabilizing. So I don't imagine that that's going to play any role in some kind of future peace deal. I am wondering, I mean, the more immediate question seems to me to be Crimea, right? Will there be a peace achieved between Russia and Ukraine where Crimea remains in Russian hands? There are lots of reasons why that seems like a problematic outcome, given that it was seized by force. On the other hand, can we see, and how do we feel about a war that's required, or the military effort that might be required to spring Crimea from Russian possession? So, I really don't think Kaliningrad factors into this conversation. I'd be surprised if anybody else was trying to make an issue of it.
Thank you. Pasud, one of our PhD students, is wondering whether there's also a generational switch going on in Germany, that the Green Party, which are usually supported by younger voters, that they are more interested in defense and security issues and perhaps German geopolitical leadership than the usually somewhat older SPD leadership and voters who vote for the SPD. Would you think there's something in that, Ulrike?
So I've been fascinated by these generational questions, and I wrote an essay a few years ago on the kind of millennial mindset, the German millennial mindset, with regard to politics and strategic thinking and all of this. And I was kind of talking about this post 1989 a generation which I am part of, that really grew up during these 30 years of really exceptional geopolitical calm and stability, and we really felt that kind of history was over, right? This whole narrative of the end of history was totally something that we believed in, and that the kind of big geopolitical struggles between geopolitical power were over, and it was all about kind of trade and international globalization and all of this. And so this war has definitely been a rude awakening for this generation. It also has been a rude awakening for the older generations, because they didn't make the same experiences growing up, but they very much embraced the end of history narrative, right? And so they've also been waken up. So I'm not saying that the older generations didn't buy this. It seems to me indeed that the kind of younger generations are at least willing to see military and defense in a less ideological way. There definitely is the I don't know whether it's the boomer generation, but the kind of slightly older generation, the ones before millennials, that have internalized very much this idea of the military kind of being bad and terrible and something you don't want to touch and you shouldn't be strong in. And I think the next generation, although still skeptical, and although we were kind of believing that the military just wasn't needed anymore, we don't have this immediate reaction of it than older generations have. And maybe that explains a little bit why younger people are slightly more comfortable with it. But I mean, if you look at polling, there hasn't been that much, or they haven't seen that much on it. It's not very clear, right? It's not as if you could say, okay, fine, like millennials and Gen Z.
So you wouldn't say instead of identity politics, it's international relations which will be in vogue again in the next few years.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? I don't know. I mean, I think definitely this generation now has to kind of think about these things more, and yeah, it's kind of refamiliarizing itself with it. And yeah, let me put it this way. I think within older generations, you have some of more pacifism that comes out of a reaction of the military, which comes out of kind of experiences or indirect experiences of World War II. And that just, you just don't have that anymore in the younger generations. Again, this is definitely not German society, and millennials are not embracing the military as something they like, but I think they're less they see this less negatively than maybe other generations before it.
Bill, in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, Germany was really characterized by very strong pacifism. Do you see that changing at all, or do you believe that it's just superficial because of the current emergency situation? And once the war has been hopefully finished soon, then pacifism will return.
No, actually, I think Pasuth is getting at something. I think that as Rico was mentioning about how the Green Party has long had a kind of a position that's relatively hostile toward authoritarian powers. I think that has developed into a fairly robust idea that you can't neglect military power. So I actually don't. I think the anomalous generation in some ways now is the sort of boomer generation, or the 68ers as we call them in Germany, who sort of developed a very particular take on what peace and Russia meant. And as they become less influential in politics, I actually do think it's possible that there will be a greater willingness to accept what you might say a normal amount of economic burdens would be. I'd like to turn, if it's okay to mention, so we don't have too much more time. I see there's some questions in the chat about China. I like the second question from Dave Sedor, but I'll leave it to the assistants to read out, please.
Leila, please, yeah, would you read out that question so Will can answer it?
Yes, of course. Dave Sedor would like to know, please explain the dependence of Germany on exports to China. What percentage of German exports go to China compared to other countries, such as the United States and other European countries?
So one of the unique things about Germany's export structure is that a lot of the things that Germans sell are machine tools, things that you use to make other machines. And so this is why China's been such an enormous market for Germany in the past couple of decades, because China has been building up its own industrial potential, and there's nothing that Germany exports better than factories. On the other hand, for that reason, China is actually slightly diminishing as an export market for Germany in relative importance, because China's not buying German stuff, right? The stuff that Germany actually manufactures. Other countries buy more of that. What Germany does need from China, however, are those rare earth metals that are hard to come by except from China. And that is one reason why trade between Germany and China is very, very high. And in fact, China still ranks as Germany's most significant economic partner. But you know, I do think, I mean, now that China is making its own automobiles, thanks in big part to Volkswagen's technology, et cetera, I think one can anticipate that there will be less and less demand in China for German products, and especially German, you know, machine making products.
Which is really bad news for the German economy. I mean, just everything that Will said is correct. Just one word on the German car manufacturers. So the problem is that the German economy and industry really depends quite a bit on the car industry, because there are so many. So it's companies in and of themselves that are obviously big and important, but also there are a lot of small and medium-sized companies that produce single things for the car industry, right? You know, the little bolt that really is important for the Mercedes or something like that. And the big car manufacturers, I think probably in particular, do depend quite a bit on China as an export market. And so if this goes down substantially, that really has very negative repercussions for the car manufacturers and then for German industry in general. So that's something people are worried about, and rightly so.
Thank you. Do you detect strains in the German-American relationship regarding China above all, Will, but also perhaps regarding the war in Ukraine and relations with Russia? Or?
Yeah, you know, I have to admit, when Scholz was first in office, I was hoping that he was a bit more of a hawk on China. I had you know, been looking at U.S. interactions with the Trump administration interacting with the Merkel government, and you know, on a lot of positions, the Trump administration was basically saying, watch out for Huawei, you know, watch out for Chinese companies. They're probably going to be you know, using intelligence operations in a you know, like there's a danger in using Chinese products. And the German response was typically, don't tell us what to do. Don't try and interfere with our own trade. And I think that Germans are more aware now that there is a cost to having Chinese business partners. So it may be that there will be a little less strain on U.S.-German relations over China. Again, Scholz himself seems to have recognized that there's a commonality of interests in the West, that, you know, in some ways the democracies do stand for something that's different than whatever it is that China stands for. But that's pretty vague. And, you know, one of the questions in the chat was, what happens if China invades Taiwan? How are Germans going to respond to that? I have to say, I'm not sure that they would react very strongly. I might be wrong about that, but you know, that Pacific theater probably doesn't resonate very strongly for Germans.
Wouldn't the Americans expect the Allies to really come strongly in and support the American side?
Well, what does support mean, right? Like, I mean, would Germans endorse the Chinese action? Certainly not. I would hope that they would also recognize this to be, you know, violations of aggression, you know, UN, et cetera, et cetera. But gosh, I mean, would they participate in sanctions under US pressure against China? Yeah, but I mean, can you see Germans contributing militarily in any way to a conflict in East Asia? I can't. If they're having a hard time mustering that enthusiasm, you know, if they're kind of doing the right thing slowly in Ukraine, I just can't imagine that this would be seen as a vital German interest.
Okay, thank you. What do you think, Ulrike?
No, one last sentence on what Will just said on possible contributions. I think the deal in such a scenario of a kind of Chinese aggression against Taiwan and the US response to that would be that the Europeans would be expected to take care of the European theater more than kind of liberate US forces there. So I don't think that there's a real expectation that Europeans would be very present in a Pacific theater. I mean, with certain exceptions with the French and the Brits, because they're there already. I mean, France is a kind of Indo-Pacific power to begin with, and Britain is the closest US ally and also quite present there. But other than that, the idea is more within NATO and within the transatlantic alliance that the Europeans would allow the US to kind of liberate forces and equipment in the European theater, and so on NATO's eastern flank, so towards Russia. And no one really expects a German frigate in the Indo-Pacific fighting a war against, being part of a war against China. And also a German frigate wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. So that's not what the military planners are thinking of.
I thought you were saying it wouldn't make it there.
Come on.
Thank you. Emma, let's try to squeeze in one final question before I have a final question to our speakers.
Of course. Stuart Kaplan asks, are most Germans resigned to see eventual Russian success in seizing the Donbas and Crimea regions, irrespective of their government's public pronouncements? Is there a generational divide in these feelings?
I don't think that Germans are resigned to that. No, I think everyone is watching the same kind of the war developing as it is. I mean, you have people who always believe that Russia was stronger and so would prevail in the end. I mean, the last year hasn't been good to them, but still, I mean, it's still a position you can hold. We don't know. I think a lot of Germans were surprised that Russia was weaker than what they would have thought, and many experts thought. But no, I don't think that there's this belief that that's what's going to happen. No idea on the generational divide on that, to be honest. I'm not sure whether there's a generational divide on likelihood of success or belief on the likelihood of success of Russian on the Russian aggression. I don't think so.
Thank you.
There's a pretty political divide, I would say briefly. I think the Left Party and the AfD would probably both argue that, you know, those should just be left to Russia and let's be done with this fighting. But I don't think that that's a majority opinion. I think those are very particular views.
And the Germans are not getting fed up with the war. It's being dragging on too long. It's being too expensive, and just settle and agree on some bad compromise that is not in the pipeline.
Yes and no. I mean, so far, German public opinion has held up quite well on this. There hasn't been enormous movement. I mean, the big movement in a way was when the first news of the atrocities that Russian soldiers were and are committing in Ukraine, when these news broke, so Bucha and all of that really had an impact on German population and German politics. And given that we continue hearing about this, I think most Germans really feel that that cannot stand and should not stand. But sure, I mean, the longer this war goes on, and if it just kind of freezes and nothing is happening, I think there is a danger of losing public support, and not just in Germany, of course, but in Europe more broadly, and most importantly in the US. I think if the US falls, then that's the biggest the biggest concern here, really. But I mean, for now, no, I think there is an overall agreement that we should be helping Ukraine because it's the right thing to do. So morally speaking, and again, here I think the war crimes really do play a role. And then secondly, the kind of more geopolitical point of this cannot stand, and if Russia succeed, what message does this send into the world? This is something that this is a kind of way that Germans haven't really been thinking like a lot, but this is becoming more of a talking point even in the more public discussion. But yeah, it can't hold forever. So we'll see.
Will, do you agree with that?
I do. I don't think that public opinion in Germany is at the risk of suddenly turning against the conflict. I think the resolution of the energy situation has been nearly miraculous, and that really helps explain we didn't have the kind of cold winter that people were fearing, and that if something like that should come about, perhaps the war's popularity would diminish. But I think the most important thing would be if there was a sense that we got to the fall and nothing had really been resolved and it remained a stalemate, people might start to question whether it's realistic that Ukraine can really clear the soil of Russian invaders. But I mean, the military situation doesn't seem to be yet so bogged down that is, yet a concern. And I certainly hope.
Towards the end, I always like to ask a question to predict the future, which is of course always very difficult, but you predict the future, the future of the Scholz government and the future of Scholz's foreign policy. If you had to predict in a reasonable way, what would your prediction be?
I don't think I can say anything more deep than what I already said, which is that I think it's probably not going to last through the term. I might be wrong about that. I feel more comfortable predicting that the Ukraine will emerge from this conflict as a much stronger European power than it would have absent this terrible conflict.
But poor old Olaf Scholz will fall from power prematurely. That's your prediction. We will check that out in the future. Ulrike, what is your prediction?
So I don't really think that he'll not last this this legislative period. I would be surprised if any of the parties toppled this government, because it wouldn't really be in their interest, and there are no good alternatives. And that's what this is all about. But yeah, so I don't think that's likely, but I also have no idea. So who are we to say? In terms of foreign policy, I mean, I think German foreign policy and the kind of German policy in general, like, loves continuity, and we already had so much upheaval right now that I don't think we're going to see any more kind of big swings. They're going to try and keep the ship steady in choppy waters. So again, I also don't expect that the China strategy that's coming is going to be this kind of big swing, but I think the war in Ukraine has taught Germans a little bit about dealing with big authoritarian powers. So there will be changes and nuances, but I don't think there will be big swings.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our two excellent speakers, Ulrike Franke and Will Gray, for a great performance, for enlightening us about what is going on in Germany and indeed in the wider world. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for the Krasno Global event today. Much appreciated. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us. Quite a large number of people have stuck with us from the beginning to the very end, which is always much appreciated. Our next Krasno event is in April, when we will talk about China and the current situation in China, and of course China's foreign policy. And at that time, Susan Shirk will join us, as well as Kaiser Kuo. For now, I would like to thank you once again to Will Gray and Ulrike Franke, and our audience. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll see you again in April. And of course, remember our YouTube channel. Our videos will all be put on our YouTube channel within a couple of days, so you can watch all our past videos and the current ones whenever you feel like it, and you can watch them even repeatedly if you wish. That is quite possible. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.